Hey guys, we are finally beginning our coverage of the Traitors US Season 3 following the first batch of episodes. And I feel like this has been a pretty fun season so far, as usual with the Traitors. You have a bunch of people that I recognize from Survivor and Big Brother, and there's some pretty interesting gameplay going on, but we'll get to that soon enough. But we have 23 people to talk about as with some more time. Let's get into the video. So starting off at number 23, we have the first boot of the season, and here we have Dorinda. And I feel like Dorinda got your pretty standard content for someone who's booted early here, where she does get the first confessional of the season talking about how she is from New York and then how everyone knows her as the lady of the manor, but she plans to leave as queen of the castle, which sure, I guess. But obviously the bulk of her content comes after the first mission, where she gets really upset by that, and that makes her a pretty prime target to be murdered here, and sure enough, she is eventually murdered to break up the housewives. And I feel like there's not too much to say with Dorinda here. I feel like she got just enough content to set up her eventual boot here to where we got to know her a little bit, and then she's gone. So again, there's that. But obviously she's now out of the game to where she's here at number 23. Now moving on to number 22, and we have the next boot on the board, and here we have Wells, the first person banished from a round table. And I find Wes's arc across these first few episodes pretty interesting, where while it seemed like Tom was going to be the one who's going to get all paranoid and really work his way out of the house because of that, I feel like Wells ended up taking up a lot of that during the actual banishment episode, where he ends up getting pretty paranoid and thinking that Robin's the traitor. You have him getting really defensive during the round table. You have a lot of people calling him cold and being turned off by him. And I was a bit surprised by this turnaround, where I thought Tom was going to be the one that was going to have this trajectory, but instead it ends up being Wells, which is pretty interesting there. But beyond that, he did get to talk a bit about how he knows Survivor people and that they know how to screw people over while he's on a dating show. So we did get to know him a little bit, but I still found his arc across the season somewhat fascinating. But he's now out of the game as well, to where he's here number 22. Now moving on to number 21, and we have the next boot on the board, and here we have Ion. And Ion was just kind of there, if I'm being honest, where she mainly got Dodo content early on about how she's used to being paid for being beautiful, and that she's not used to activating her brain, and that she needs to work that out. You also have her saying that her son thought she was going to be the first boot during the first breakfast, only for her to be the second boot, so much for that. And in general, I feel like Ion was just kind of there. Didn't really feel that great about her by the end of it. But obviously she's not out of the game as well, to where she's here at number 21. Now moving on to number 20, and we have the final boot from this batch of episodes. And here we have Tony Velachos. And obviously it's disappointing seeing him being such an early boot here, even though it wasn't that unexpected, where he obviously had a pretty big target on his back coming into the season. And at the point where he was made a faithful instead of a traitor, you knew that he was going to have a pretty uphill battle in terms of actually getting through a lot of the season there. And obviously he gets a decent amount of content during this first batch of episodes here. And we definitely see him like trying to play the game, even though it was pretty unlikely that it was going to work out for him. And eventually he is voted out at the second banishment. Though I will say that his actual exit from the game was pretty fascinating, where he calls Boston Rob a sellout and has a pretty emotional reveal that he's a faithful. So I feel like, considering that Tony was an early boot, I feel like it went about as well as it could have from an entertainment standpoint, even though I was never going to be that high on him considering the target on his back. But obviously he is now out of the game, to where he's here number 20. And with that, we have 19 people left to get to talk about. And as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based with their edit and current game position. And as I said before, I feel like doing a power ranking like this for the Traitors is more difficult than it is for other shows, considering the nature of the show, considering that certain people are going to get more screen time inherently based off whether they're a traitor or faithful. Also, the fact that there could be multiple winners or even no winner in some cases. I feel like it's heavily more difficult to do a power ranking like this for the Traitors, but I'm going to do my best here. But number 19, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on, is Bob Harper. And Bob Harper was actually one of the few non-Survivor and Big Brother people that I recognized coming into the season, considering I did watch The Biggest Loser as a kid. And in general, it was kind of surreal seeing him on a show like this, but I feel like Bob is one of the more under-edited people across the season so far, where he's one of the few people that have yet to receive a single confessional outside of missions. And I feel like of those people, I feel like Bob had the most excuse to get content here, where first up you have him defending Wells during the first roundtable, only for him to not get his way there. But then even more so, he got plenty of focus during the latest episode, where he obviously had Tony throwing him under the bus during the mission. You have Tony accusing him of being a traitor. You have him really fighting back during that roundtable and sending Tony out. But despite this, we don't really get much of Bob's actions outside of that, where we don't really see him like strategizing. We don't see him trying to clear his name when Tony's targeting him. And I feel like considering he had the most excuse to get content, but despite this, we don't hear more from his perspective. He doesn't really get many confessionals. I feel like that's a pretty big indictment to Bob's edit here, where it feels like he's only being shown when it's absolutely necessary. And I feel like of the people who have gotten no confessionals so far, I feel like Bob had the most excuse to do so, but yet he still didn't. And to me, that's a major red flag that he's probably not winning, that the show's not really focusing on his perspective and not really focusing on his story across the season, when this could have been an opportunity for us to learn more about him. So I feel like for those reasons, I'm probably the most out on Bob compared to everyone else, which is why he's here number 19. Now moving on to number 18, and we have another person who was pretty under-edited across these episodes, and here we have Kiara. And Kiara's another one who hasn't really gotten any confessionals across these episodes here, where her only content of note comes during the first roundtable where she throws out Lord Ivar's name, but beyond that we haven't really seen much from Kiara. She's really just fodder at this point. And the only reason she's above Bob Harper is she at least had more of an excuse to not get much content here, to where you could at least say that she could get more content later, but beyond that, I feel like she has pretty much no chance of winning from this point, which is why she's here number 18. Now moving on to number 17, and we have another person who has gotten no confessionals outside of missions, and here we have Sam. And Sam's another one who is pretty under-edited here, which is actually a bit surprising, as he actually got a bit of focus early on, talking about how people recognized him as Britney Spears' ex, but beyond that, I feel like we don't really know much about Sam's position in the game. We don't really know what he's doing in the game, and I feel like he's probably one of the least likely people to win because of that. And while I don't think he's necessarily going to be a boot in the next couple rounds, I feel like he's someone who I'm not feeling that great about in the long term, to where he's here number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we have someone who actually did get a bit more focus across the episodes, even though I'm not feeling that great about him. And here we have Lord Ivar. And I feel like my thoughts on Lord Ivar are not that dissimilar from John Burkow from last season. Mind you, John Burkow made it quite a bit further than I expected, but I feel like Lord Ivar is someone who doesn't really come off that well in the actual show here, where you already have people targeting him in the first couple roundtables. You have him not really doing that much in the game. You have him not really getting that much content, really, where he only gets one confessional about how everyone's clutching at straws. And beyond that, you have one scene of him talking about his royal background. But beyond that, I feel like he doesn't come off in that great of a light. You have people being sus of him already. You have him voting incorrectly at both roundtables so far, which is also not a great look. In general, I feel like he's a pretty unlikely winner as well. I can't really imagine him getting all the way to the end, but he at least got a bit more content than the people we already talked about, to where he's here at number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we have another person who I'm not feeling the greatest about, and here we have Dolores. And Dolores is also just kind of there, if I'm being honest. Now, she actually got somewhat decent content in the premiere, talking about how her dad was the chief of police and that she wants the hall pass to be bad but being a traitor, only for her to not be a traitor, so there's that. But beyond that, I feel like her game position is not that strong, to where you already have her being considered a potential murder target across the first 2 rounds. You also have her drawing votes from her from the roundtables as well. I feel like there's not really that much to say positively about Dolores here, outside of her getting some content that wasn't entirely necessary, with her getting to talk about how she wanted to be a traitor. But beyond that, I feel like Dolores is not in the greatest spot, and I feel like she hasn't really gotten that much of a focus in the actual story, to where she's here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we have someone who probably would be a bit higher, if not for the fact that they could be murdered in the next round, but we do have Nikki. And I feel like Nikki is someone who has been getting a somewhat interesting edit so far, where she actually gets a decent confessional early on about how she's a champion and that she wants to be one somewhere else. And beyond that, she has established relationships with Gabby and Chriselle through their alliance, the Bambis, but I feel like a lot of that's from Gabby's perspective more so than Nikki's. And I feel like there's also the fact that Nikki has been shortlisted for murder, where she is one of the 3 targets that could be murdered in this next round. And I feel like that alone is a big reason why I can't really have her too high, especially with the other people shortlisted being people I'm a bit higher on compared to Nikki. So I feel like mixing that in with the fact that I feel like Nikki's still someone who could go in the next round, considering the fact that even within her established relationships, I feel like those other people have a bit more going on. I feel like Nikki's probably someone who could just be sniped out in the next week, to where she's here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we have someone who I just mentioned, but we do have Gabby. And I feel like Gabby's another person who has gotten somewhat interesting content here, where she got to call Ivar for being a walking red flag due to his background. You also have her establishing this relationship with Chriselle and Nikki and getting to talk about that alliance in the Bambis. But I feel like considering that Nikki is one of the shortlisted people to be murdered, that I could easily see that alliance being broken up. And beyond that, I feel like there are other people that I'm simply higher on at this point compared to Gabby, so to where I could see Gabby being like someone who's on the outs moving forward. So I'm not feeling the greatest about Gabby at this point, and while there's definitely room for her to move up in the coming weeks, I feel like she's still someone who I'm not getting the greatest sense from at this point, to where she's here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have someone who I'm actually a bit surprised is as high as they are, but I still feel like they have potential to be a bigger character on the season, and here we have Robin. And I'm not getting the greatest sense from Robin here, where while she is a bigger character in the show and someone who has gotten a decent amount of content, I'm not sure we're supposed to be seeing her as a competent player per se, where while she does be the one that puts the target onto Wells during the first round, you also have her talking about how she can read people well, which is playing over Dodo music, which I'm not getting the greatest sense from there. You also have her being a pretty big target across each of the first two roundtables there, and while she's able to get around that, I feel like we're not supposed to be seeing Robin as an underdog that is overcoming tough circumstances. I feel like she's just kind of there beyond the points where she's being targeted, and while she's getting her way with voting out Wells at the first roundtable and voting out Tony at the second one, you still have her being seen as a potential target there. She's someone who has been considered for murder during the first two rounds, and I feel like she's not really meant to be propped up as a sympathetic figure. So I feel like Robin's someone who I'm not feeling that great about at this point. I don't really see her as a very likely winner, but it's the fact that she's gotten a bigger edit compared to other people and is meant to be a more major figure in the season is a big reason why she's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and I'm actually surprised this person is as high as they are considering how bad their start was. But number 11, we do have Tom Sandoval, and Tom is another weird case here, as he is someone who I initially thought was going to come off as this really paranoid figure, where we see him ripping off his blindfold really fast during the first round table just to see what the reactions are. You have him really getting all jittery and acting super uncomfortable. You have people noticing how intense he's acting, and obviously these things aren't great. And I'm actually a bit surprised that he actually ended up surviving the first roundtable after Wells, of all people, ended up inheriting a lot of his tendencies thereafter. And beyond that, you have him not having the greatest reads in the world, where you have him saying during the first breakfast that he feels good about Bob the Drag Queen and Carolyn when they're both traitors, and instead having his eyes set on Jeremy and Chriselle, which is obviously not great there. But the main reason I have Tom as high as he is I feel like he at least has some setup to a future storyline where, for one, you have his opening confessional about how he wants to be a faithful and that he wouldn't do well as a traitor. Sure enough, he is a faithful there. But then beyond that, you have his whole relationship with Chriselle, where it's been established that the two have a history from outside the show, and that has played a factor in the game, where Tom has been critical of Chriselle, and Chriselle has accused him of being biased against her. And obviously, while that's not great on Tom, the fact that he is using these preconceived notions against him. We also saw last season that CT and Trishelle also had some beef from outside the game, and a major focus on the season was them repairing the relationship and being able to get to the end together. Now, I'm not saying that Tom and Chriselle are like CT and Trishelle by any means, but I feel like the fact that we are getting this relationship established from pretty early on makes me think that's going to be a major focus on the season in some way or another. And whether that leads to a win or whether it leads to them having this huge falling out, or maybe one of them becomes a traitor later on and betrays the other, and we'll have to see how that goes per se, but I feel like the fact that we are at least getting this established storyline, this established relationship between the two, makes me think that at the very least Tom is going to be around for a bit and be able to realize the storyline in some way or another. And while there are still plenty of red flags that make me think that Tom won't be the winner by the end of it, I feel like the fact that we have this groundwork set up makes me comfortable enough to have him this high on the list, to where he's here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have someone who I just mentioned, but we do have Chriselle. And I feel like Chriselle is on a similar boat to Tom here. Both of them have the potential for this storyline between them to play out in some way or another, even though I don't think it's a guarantee that it'll play out in a positive way for them. But the reason I have Chriselle above Tom is I feel like we gotten a bit more from Chriselle beyond this, to where we know she has pretty good relationships with Nikki and Gabby there, while we don't really have those same relationships with Tom outside Chriselle. So I feel like those things put Chriselle above Tom in my eyes, but even so, I still have plenty of question marks about her, and I feel better about other people at this point, if I'm being honest. So for those reasons, I still have Chriselle relatively low at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we're finally moving back to one of the bigger names on the board, at least from my perspective, and here we have Brittany Haynes. And Obviously, Brittany was one of the more notable figures on the board for me, being a Big Brother player. Though at the same time, I feel like she's gotten by far the least amount of content of the people from these bigger shows, where while she did get some content early on talking about her beef with Danielle from Reindeer Games and how she wanted to be a traitor only for her to not be a traitor, I feel like all that content was in the premiere, and after that she's been pretty much quiet, which is pretty disappointing to see there, and obviously makes me much lower on her chances of winning compared to other people. Now, obviously, she does have the storyline with Danielle, and I feel like that will play out in some fashion, where we've been seeing Brittany being a consideration for Danielle's decisions and who to murder and what to do as a traitor. And I feel like this will boil over at some point, where Brittany and Danielle will get into some clash that will either result in Brittany figuring out Danielle and taking her out of the game, or Danielle deciding to murder Brittany, which, sure, I guess. So I definitely feel like we are getting this storyline that Brittany and Danielle are not on the greatest terms. And unlike Tom and Chriselle, I don't feel that confident that they'll be able to smooth it over, where it seems like Danielle is definitely looking to get revenge on Brittany for Brittany taking her out of Reindeer Games. So I'm not feeling the greatest about Brittany. She's probably the person I'm the lowest on out of the Survivor and Big Brother people, which is pretty unfortunate. So because of that, she is here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we are finally getting to our first traitor on the board. But here we have Boston Rob, and admittedly I think this is more so based around my gut feeling about how the game is going to play out compared to what we've seen on the show so far, even though we have seen Rob already being talked about as this big throughout in the show, and how people in the game recognize him as a scary player. But I feel like Rob is just very unlikely to actually win the game here. Now, mind you, I thought the same thing last year during Deal or No Deal Island, but even then, Rob still got pretty far into the game. But I feel like Rob is someone who just inherently comes off as a very threatening figure, and through that, I just find it very hard to see how it gets towards the very end of the game, not just due to him being this inherently threatening figure, but also the way that he enters the game, where he just enters the game late with 2 other people, and through that, you would assume the faithfuls would assume that one of these 3 people that entered the game late would be a traitor, so I feel like Rob is someone who will definitely be a target at some point. Now, beyond that, you have him still being involved in what the traitors are doing and kind of being a voice for a reason for them, where you have him pushing back against Bob the Drag Queen's suggestion of making Carolyn one of the shortlisted people during the latest episode. You also have him giving a shield to Tony, only to later target Tony, and Tony calling him a sellout after being voted out, which is pretty funny. And honestly, I don't think Rob has been playing that poorly so far, and I don't think Rob has been getting that bad of content considering the circumstances. I just don't think he's going to get to the end. I don't think he's going to get all the way to the end without being targeted. And in general, I feel like he's probably the person I had the least amount of faith in to win out of the traitors, but he's still someone who will probably be in the game for a bit. I still think he'll probably be used as a shield for a bit, even if people catch on to him being a traitor, but I just don't think he's going to win by the very end of it. So because of that, he is here at number 8. Now moving on to number 8, and we have another pretty notable player to get into here, and here we have Jeremy Collins. And obviously Jeremy's another person who I was looking out for coming into the season, considering his background. And Jeremy's actually someone who I would have had a bit higher, if not for the fact that he is shortlisted for murder here, where he is one of the options to be murdered due to this next twist. And a lot of that stemming from him throwing Danielle under the bus, where he is now sus of Danielle, and through that Danielle wants to get back at him. And obviously, it would be a pretty bad move for them to murder Jeremy here, as it would just put a major target on Danielle's back, though we'll talk about Danielle in a moment. But I still feel like Jeremy is still technically in danger coming into this next round, and he still has not actually survived a single round of gameplay without some sort of immunity, where he's had shields now for both of the murders so far, so I feel like that's at least something worth mentioning here. But beyond that, I feel like Jeremy's someone who I actually feel alright about coming into the season, where he got to talk quite a bit about his relationship with Tony coming into the season, and how he's a firefighter, and how he doesn't leave his family for nothing, he'll do anything to win. And while we saw him talking about feeling good about Bob the Drag Queen, which is obviously not the greatest read, he is catching on to Danielle in some capacity, where he was throwing Danielle under the bus, and while it's a big reason why he's in danger right now, it could also be a reason why he stays, as obviously it would be a bad move for them to murder Danielle right after he threw Danielle under the bus, as it would just put a ton of sus on Danielle. So obviously that could give him some safety there, and he's probably not the person I'm looking at to be murdered in this next episode here, but he's still technically in danger to begin with, and I feel like I'm probably a bit higher than other people looking back on our edits. So because of that, I have Jeremy at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have another pretty big name on the board and another traitor to get into, and here we have Danielle Reyes. And honestly, I'm a bit surprised by how high Danielle Reyes is, considering I feel like there's already a bunch of knocks against her, and in general, I feel very certain she is not going to win the season. where obviously it is exciting to see her being a traitor here, being chosen there, and obviously through that you would expect her to get a decent amount of content. Though at the same time, I feel like we're already starting to see pretty bad signs from her where she's been doing a lot of overacting, where you have her getting pretty upset during the challenge to really sell that she's a faithful there. You also have her talking about how she's an award-winning actress and how she can sell anything, but then you have her talking way too much during the second breakfast, just spewing all sorts of thoughts about who she thinks could be murdered here. And obviously, you even have Rob talking about how she should shut up. And I feel like we are starting to see the wheels coming off a bit for Danielle here. You have a rivalry with Brittany, where Brittany is obviously very wary of her. You have Jeremy starting to catch on to her as well, where Jeremy is telling people that he's sus of her as well. And you even have this decision to shortlist Jeremy in a spot to where if they murder Jeremy here, that will just paint a terrible light on her and just make her a pretty prime target there as well. So I feel like Danielle is someone who, the fact that we're already seeing flaws from her in episode 3 is a pretty bad sign for her moving forward. I feel like we're just going to get more of this moving forward until eventually she is eventually caught and she is taken out of the game because of that. But she's still someone who has been getting a decent amount of screen time, and I feel the fact that she is a traitor inherently gives her an advantage over a lot of faithfuls in the game. That's a big reason why she is at least this high in the power ranking. But she is still someone who I feel very certain is not winning at this point, to where she's here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we have another traitor to get into, believe it or not, and here we have Bob the Drag Queen. And obviously Bob is already proven to be a pretty major character in the season, someone who's been getting tons of screen time there, and obviously he's pretty fun to watch, but I feel like as a traitor, he is definitely giving some questionable signs at this point, where I feel like his biggest issue is that he's trying to be the leader of the traitors, trying to drive every single decision. And we're seeing him just completely steamroll Carolyn at every opportunity, just completely ignoring what she wants and just dictating the action. And while it's good in the sense that he is being a dominant force there, I feel like he's also pushing Carolyn away in a spot to where it'll just cause his distrust within the traitors moving forward. So I feel like he's not really taking that into account. But beyond that, you have him being really active around the house, just constantly bouncing from group to group, constantly checking in with people. And we're already starting to see sus being drawn to him due to him just being really active in the game, where you have the likes of Dylan catching on to him. And obviously that's not particularly great. You have him finding out that Dylan's onto him, and his first thought is to confront Dylan, only to eventually be talked out of that. And I feel like Bob the Drag Queen is also showing some serious flaws as a traitor. And the fact that we're already seeing these flaws in episode 3 just makes me think it's a matter of when, not if, he gets caught. So similar to Danielle, I'm also not feeling that great about Bob's chances of winning. And the main reason he's this high is because he has been one of the bigger focuses on the show from a screen time perspective. And just from a gameplay perspective, being a traitor gives you a massive advantage early on. But at the same time, I don't think it's going to last the entire season. I feel like Bob will drop off at some point. So because of that, he is here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and I honestly consider having this person lower simply because we haven't gotten that much from them. And to be fair, they probably are a bit too high still, but I still feel like I'm a bit more confident in them compared to other people. And here we have Wes, one of the later entries here. And admittedly, I think there is some knocks to bring up here with Wes, like the fact that you haven't talked about how he wants to work with the Survivor people, as the Survivor people are strong and they all vote together, only for Tony and Rob to immediately be at odds with each other, which is pretty funny there. But beyond that, I think Wes is still someone who could be like this affable presence, someone who is just there for a while here. Now, beyond that, I feel like there isn't really that much to go off of based off Wes. And there's obviously some worry that he could be this target due to him being this later entry. But I just couldn't really find a better place to put him at this point, if I'm being honest. I feel like next week we'll definitely have a better sense of where these later entries truly stand in the game. But I feel like for now, 4 is a good enough spot for him, but it's more so because I have bigger holes with other people. So because of that, he's here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and I've seen some people online saying that this person's a lock to win. However, I'm still a bit hesitant to call them a frontrunner. But number 3, we do have Dylan Efron, and Dylan's gotten one of the biggest edits of the Faithfuls, and particularly of the non-Survivor and Big Brother people so far, where he obviously has a lot of focus on him being Zac Efron's brother, and he does get decent content early on talking about how he feels like the underdog playing with these reality icons, and that he wants to play the game as a true faithful, which later leads to him being the first to figure out Bob the Drag Queen as a potential traitor, which is all pretty good content there. So I feel like there's definitely some things you can prop up with Dylan. Now beyond that, I think there's definitely some things you can call into question, like the fact that he's been getting such a big edit so far, and I feel like he has been a bit overexposed. So I think that makes him a bit less likely to win in my eyes. I could also see him making some mistakes along the way, like him getting into conflicts with people, like where we saw Bob the Drag Queen almost get into a confrontation with him after finding out that Dylan was throwing his name out there. So I could definitely see him getting into some trouble here. And even with his storyline about him like growing as a player along the way, I could see that being like this journey edit that could lead to him being cut right before the end. So I'm definitely a bit skeptical about Dylan, to where while he's definitely a front runner, considering these considerations I just mentioned, considering he is one of the most developed players, especially among the faithful so far, I think there's just enough question marks with whether he can sustain this for the entire season that leaves him behind here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and we actually have the highest ranked faithful left on the board, and here we have Derek Levasseur, and Derek's another pretty big name here. Obviously pretty excited to see him here, and interestingly, I think he's probably gotten the cleanest edit so far compared to the late entries here, where he has been getting somewhat decent content with him getting to explain his perspective and multiple opportunities. He's also not really drawing that big of a target on his back, despite him being this winner, where you would expect more people to talk about Derek as being, oh, the greatest Big Brother player of all time, but they aren't really talking about him the same way that they are with Boston Rob, which I feel like is pretty good there. And then you have him not having the same issue with Wes, where Wes talked about working with the Survivor people when that wasn't a very viable option. So I feel like Derek is in a pretty good spot in the house at this point, and I feel like with him still having room to grow from an edit standpoint, I'm not feeling pretty good about Derek at this point, and that's a big reason why he is this high on the list. But still, he is still a relatively late entry, and there's still some question marks over whether he can truly sustain this. That leaves him behind here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win the Traitors Season 3 at this point is Carolyn Weiger. And I wasn't fully expecting this coming to the season for Carolyn to be a frontrunner this early in the season, but I think for now it kind of fits, where we have her being named a traitor from early on, which is a pretty interesting prospect considering you wouldn't expect her to be a traitor. And I think it's probably one of the biggest boons for her so far, where we have actively seen people talking about how they can't suspect that Carolyn's a traitor because she's simply too expressive and she can't hide it very well. But despite this, I feel like Carolyn's the least flawed of the traitors that we've seen so far, where she has a somewhat level head over what they should be doing. But despite this, she keeps getting ran over, which I think is probably the most tragic element to all this, that despite her wanting to have a role in what the traitors do, you have the likes of Bob the Drag Queen and Danielle Reyes just completely overriding her at every single opportunity, and her just not getting her way with the actual murders here. But despite this, you have people in the house talking about how, like, they don't suspect Carolyn's a traitor at all, which is all pretty good there. And it's actually kind of funny that we are seeing this right after I recorded my Survivor runner-up ranking, where I talked in that video about how Carolyn was in a similar spot to where, despite her wanting to get her way and despite her having opportunities to have agency, she just keeps having these opportunities stripped away by other people and just other people getting their way over her. So the fact that we are seeing this again is obviously pretty unfortunate and obviously not ideal, but it is kind of working out for her so far in the sense that she's not being suspected. And I feel like with the likes of Danielle and Bob the Drag Queen having so much sus on them already, while Carolyn simply doesn't have that, all while she's still being shown in a somewhat positive light, is a major reason why I have her as a frontrunner at this point, believe it or not. Now, obviously, whether she'll be able to sustain that, we'll have to see, but I feel like she's easily the person I feel the most confident of to actually win the game of the Traitors, and I feel like she definitely has enough pros going for her in the edit to justify her excessive screen time, but also her storyline moving forward. So I feel like for those reasons, I'm feeling pretty good about Carolyn at this point, which is why she's here number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so you look forward to that. I'm covering Hell's Kitchen and doing Survivor videos here and there during the off season, so you can expect weekly content of that. I'm on Patreon and have YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.